Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today to talk about your experiences, what you have lost, what you have learned, and also to share some advice, words of wisdom regarding this disease, this battle against opioids. So let's start with talking about your son before the disease. Tell us who he was.
He was just a shining star and magnetic. He was the kid who every girl wanted to be around and every boy wanted to be just like.
He was a normal little boy. We have 13 acres of woods out back, and he would always be climbing a tree out there, or, you know, finding bugs and bringing them home and wanting to show them. And he loved to tinker and take things apart and put things back together.
Oh, Steve, he was a really interesting kid. He was intellectual, and but he was much taller than me and better looking, and just a real sweet person. He loved animals.
He was someone who was always so proud, and even if he didn't show his pride, he was proud. He knew how intelligent he was and how special he was and how different he was, and that made him special.
He was very, very kind, giving soul. He had a lot of soul. He composed music. He taught himself algorithms in order to compose music.
Ray was very well known for being very funny. He was a very bright kid, and he was loyal to a fault. Of course, the disease changes all that, but prior to that, you know, he definitely was very well known for his sense of humor.
She was a beautiful, 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 beautiful girl. She loved to dance. She loved her family. She loved her family.
Everybody liked Nick, which was nice. But Nick had some problems with depression. You know, he'd be the jokester and the class clown, but then silently he would be kind of sad, and I noticed that in him, and I took him to the doctor. And
When was this? When
that was like late middle school, early high school.
it became evident, clear enough that you have to take him to the
Yeah,
doctor.
that I wanted something. Like I would ask him, what's wrong, Nick? Why are you so sad? And he couldn't verbalize it. He would never really tell me, what's wrong. And the doctor gave us, a therapist to go to, but Nick wouldn't get out of the car to go. We had the appointment, drove there, and he wouldn't get out of the car.
I did try and speak with him, but he was a vault. He was either joking, everything's fine, or he wasn't speaking. So he was not one to readily open up. I did notice, some changes. We did put him in counseling. Unfortunately, it never really helped in the way that we had hoped. And it wasn't until just before he died that he revealed that an older boy had in fact caused some trauma in his youth when he was pretty young. And I didn't know that because he never divulged that, not even in therapy.
I didn't know back then when he lost his dad at 6 years old how badly it affected him, because he didn't seem to have changed too much at all. I don't think it hit him till he was a teenager. And he would be around his friends playing ball with their fathers, and that's when I think he really realized that he had a loss, because boys are looking for their dad, especially when they go through like puberty and stuff. I had taken him to go talk to somebody at 14 when I noticed he was starting to get depressed, but I think it was really a little too late, and he was very closed and didn't really want to speak.
He had clinical depression from when he was 6.5 years old. He was diagnosed after my fiance committed suicide. So it really set my son off. So he was on antidepressants for most of his life.
He was, he kept to himself, but he had a few friends. And he had anxiety in situations where, you know, there wouldn't be any obvious cause for it. So I think he had to live with that.
Mainly, I think he just kind of lost himself. It was almost as if he didn't know himself afterwards. And he was someone who never, ever, ever questioned his identity. And that's something that's, you know, pretty rare, I would say. And he changed. And, you know, sometimes it's for the better and sometimes it's for the worse. And unfortunately, in his case, it was for the worse. And
you never think when you have a young boy like that he's going to grow up and become addicted to a drug. You just don't.
And addiction doesn't run on my side of the family, you know, and I think I just assumed he was like me, that, you know, he would either get sick from it or it would never affect him. I mean,
I think part of it was we live in a bubble here in Newton, where we're around lots of wealth, and we were raised with money, and you think that, well, upper middle class kids don't fall into this kind of thing. And that myth really got in the way in my thinking, certainly, and my wife's to some extent. We just couldn't believe it would be our own child, but it was.
2011, she got pregnant. And prior to her getting pregnant, she got into a car accident. And the doctor prescribed her Percocets because she was in a lot of pain. She hurt herself real bad. Her doctor prescribed her Percocets. She was on the Percocets for about a year, I want to say. And then all of a sudden, he just took her off. Well, she got addicted to him. So from there, once he took her off, she started buying them on the street.
I brought him to the pediatrician and said, you know, this is what this kid is doing. You know, he's smoking, and I'm upset about it. His grades were not great at that time, even though he was in higher level classes. And the pediatrician, and this is something I've told other people about, his message to Nick was, don't smoke on the weeknights and keep your grades up. Instead of being my ally, that I wanted a doctor figure to say to him, Nick, this is not good for you. Like, there's other ways to deal with life. He just gave him kind of permission to just keep on going.
Tell me about the trip he took to the dentist, because it seems like that was the pivotal point.
that was it. He was 18, and, you know, in hindsight, now that I think back, because I only had my upper wisdom teeth, I never had all four. I wish I hadn't let them remove all four of them at once. I think that was a lot, and I think the doctor who did the work on his mouth, who really messed up that one tooth, and wrote him those prescriptions, and over again with the subsequent surgeries, I know he changed his life, and it changed mine in turn forever, but...
He came home for the summer, and he needed to have some dental work. He needed his wisdom teeth pulled, and the dentist gave him about a 2-week supply of OxyContin, and I think that was, obviously, in retrospect, that was excessive, but I think that was kind of the routine thing to do back then.
The doctors were reckless with their prescriptions, reckless. And Stephen was always so against drugs that I never in a million years, I said to him, you know, those pills are strong, let me hold them. He said, Ma, you know me, I don't take anything. It was hard enough for me to even give him an Advil if something hurt him. So I trusted him, and I trusted him enough to only take when he was in real pain, but he was in real pain. His face was like out to here.
And apparently Steve really liked it, although there was no indication that we saw. It seemed to relieve him of his anxieties, the thing that he apparently, you know, on and off been living with all his life, just built-in anxiety.
With the first pill that he took, that he felt wonderful, he said to me that it was the first time he wasn't in mental or physical pain in his life, which was sort of heartbreaking to me because I didn't know all that pain he carried for so long.
During school, during high school, his friends had traded pills and we had no clue. I just thought he was smoking pot. So they would take, you know, trade someone's ADHD medicine or go into a mom's pocketbook who had like Ativan or something like that. And then it got all the way to somebody saying, oh, here, try an Oxy. And he said to me later after the fact that when he took that, he knew that was it. Like that was, he was going to be addicted to that forever. He just felt it. Like he was like something changed in his body and all he wanted to do was have another pill.
When did you know or feel like something is seriously wrong?
About after maybe a few months, maybe actually about 2 months after he started using, I would say, heavy drugs. Pretty quickly he just really turned into himself. I think he maybe thought he was a disappointment. You know, he went away to college and he came home after a few months. He went to a university that he felt wasn't really for him. He didn't really fit in. And that was pretty much the starting point. I mean, you know, he had fun in high school, but nothing heavy, no hard drugs. And then he went away to college and he came back. And I think maybe he was, you know, afraid of disappointing his parents. Maybe he disappointed himself because he was always the kid who was so smart for high school. He was too smart for his own good. You know, he never needed to study or anything. And he didn't make it through, not even maybe a full semester in college. But that was it.
I started to see, I started to see some behaviors that were definitely concerning. So he'd have these weird mood swings. He started to drive and he had, these weird excuses for all these little accidents or truancies. And it wasn't until one of his peers divulged to me that they believed he was using drugs, and they specifically said that he was using intravenous forms of drugs, and I found that really hard to believe. I had some real difficulty until one of his friends, we used to have a finished basement, had gone down, and above the ceiling tile he had a stash of needles, of syringes.
Things didn't escalate till 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 2017. She met a guy. She was with her kid's father still, but they would get into fights and stuff, and they would split up. And when they split up, she met this other guy. Well, this guy was very bad news that she met. He told her, instead of buying Percocet, she should buy heroin. It's more cheaper. It's much, much cheaper. So that's when she started dipping in the heroin. She didn't know how to do it, so he started shooting her up. I found out after. He started shooting her up with it, and then she started learning how to shoot herself up with it. And that's where my nightmare began.
During his sophomore year, I remember us getting together, and he's telling me that he has this problem with taking this OxyContin, that he's collected some of it. And I think it was readily available, I guess, on campus. As it turned out, he was shopping prescriptions. And we, at first, were thinking, well, God, he's awful hypochondriacal with this needing to go see doctors. Well, that was actually what he was doing. And but he told me about it and basically showed me everything he had. And at that point I said, this is something you don't want to do. And I had really no idea that we were at the gaping mouth of a monster. That for him, this was going to pull him in and kill him.
I didn't realize that at the time that addiction was the same disease. I mean, I thought that it ran in the family if you were an alcoholic, but I didn't think drug addiction was a gene that ran in the family. And I really wasn't worried about him. Until a couple of months later when I noticed the change in behavior, him not being up and at it and ready, to go off to school, and then I guess just the anger, the temperament changes. So, and then when I started seeing different people come back and forth out of the house, all kinds of alarm bells went off in my head, which is why I sent him to the doctors. But when I came home that night and he told me that the doctor told him that he was addicted, I just couldn't believe it. And I knew I was in for, and he was in for hell.
Nick graduated high school, and we thought, he was just occasionally smoking the pot. He went to college down in Rhode Island. He wanted to be a pharmaceutical science major. So he got into that program, and we dropped him off, and when he came home, I could tell something was definitely wrong. He was thin, and he was a little gray. His coloring was off, and he was sick. But he didn't tell us at the time what was wrong. So I took him again to the pediatrician, and they told us, it was bronchitis and allergies and all these things, and nobody thought to test him for drugs. And I didn't think to ask, because I thought I still had a kid that just smoked pot who just went crazy down there and didn't take care of himself. Finally, one day he came to us and said, "I have something to tell you." And it was me and my husband were there, and he said, "I'm addicted to heroin." Like heroin? I was like, what? Like that's the most foreign thing from my mind. Like, what do you mean you're addicted to heroin? And he just broke down and sobbed and said, "I just want to feel normal again. I've tried to quit on my own and I can't. I just want to be Nick again, and I'm not Nick." And that's like the saddest thing ever, for someone to know that they are in so deep and not know how to get out of it. And I just felt like the floor had opened up.
Well, it was 2 days after my 50th birthday. My son was on the phone with his girlfriend. They had broken up or whatever, and he threatened. He came downstairs. He was on the phone with her for hours, and he came downstairs and he said, "I love you, and I don't want to live anymore." And so I stayed up all night. I called out sick in the morning, told him to bring me my laptop and that I could do some work from home maybe. And I got my son sectioned. He had a psychiatrist, got him section 12. And they took him to the hospital, and the hospital said that section 12 wasn't filled out properly. And so they didn't keep my son. And for some unknown reason, I took his cell phone and mine, and I drove to the hospital, thinking he was going to be, committed to the hospital. And his phone was going off, and this girl was texting him, and she kept talking about, let's do Suboxone to get off. So I knew, because I knew what Suboxone was for. So that's how I found out.
That he was...
Yeah, and then the hospital released him, and so he took a cab here, and then my sister took him in, and so I couldn't get him into any programs. The one opportunity that I would have had to get him help was sort of taken away from me.
It was sheer panic. I had never had these issues with my oldest son, and I was completely unprepared. You hear about all the warnings, and back then they certainly didn't have the education out there like they do today, because the epidemic was not, it wasn't an epidemic back then. So I was wholly unprepared for just how strong the disease fights back.
When the heroin came, that was the worst. She OD'd in my bathroom. I almost got kicked out of my house because she OD'd in my bathroom. I had to break my door down to get in there.
That was your first witnessing
Yes.
what this is?
Yes. And I busted down the door, and she was like, like having a hard time breathing. But she was out of it. She was totally out of it. So they came here. It took them 3 times, 3 knock hands to bring her back, and she was fucking pissed off that they brought her back because they fucked up her high. And she's still telling everybody she don't have a problem, blah, 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 blah. They said, you're going to the hospital. She's fighting with them. No, I'm not. They said, yes, you are. Let's go. And then she ended up having to go to the hospital. And then another time when she was pregnant, DCF came here, and I was like, what the fuck? And my daughter was here, and I'm like, what's going on? They go, she didn't tell you? And I said, tell me what? She OD'd pregnant. So she OD'd, they went to the hospital, they brought her back.
Did you ever feel like you were going to lose your son the first moment you realized that he was using?
Yes. Yes, because I knew that my son had depression. I always knew that heroin just took over people's minds. You know, their mind, body, and soul, it just took it over. I knew people do unconscionable things under the influence of that drug.
And the way we finally woke up during that time, after he graduated, he got in a minor car accident in Waltham, but he was so inebriated on medication, and I don't even know what it was, that the person who had been rear-ended by him reported it to the police. The police showed up and put him in jail because he clearly was inebriated. And I remember coming to bail him out. It was a Waltham jail, and he wasn't taking responsibility at that point for being inebriated. He was very aggressive about it, and I finally realized this is what an addict looks like. They're obsessed with getting their drug, and they're not the same person anymore.
As you're coming to realization of everything, who was there for you? Did you feel like you could speak to your family, to your friends, your co-workers about what was happening in your life?
No. And I think that's still a huge problem today because there's such a stigma attached to this disease.
Did you feel there was a stigma around you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I didn't feel there was a stigma with my family. They knew how hard I worked to raise Stephen and what a good mom I was. But I felt there was a stigma with other people who didn't know me well and might have heard that my son was addicted. And I think you always sort of feel the need to tell how much you gave to your child to sort of prove that, you know, it wasn't my fault, I wasn't a bad parent.
Although we knew many people who were therapists and who were sympathetic, we did tell our closest friends what was going on. Although it happened so quickly, it was hard to keep them up to date. But so this one good friend I can think of, and several others who I remember talking to about our situation in graphic detail, who didn't disapprove, you know, understood how serious it was. But I certainly didn't explain this to people at work. I didn't talk to my mother or brother about it much.
Could you pinpoint to why you didn't? Is it because you felt you still could control it, contain it?
Right.
Okay.
And the shame. I think shame, avoiding that intense feeling of being ashamed as though it somehow reflected on me and how we raised Steve, and that there was a failing occurring.
I didn't know anybody who was going through anything like that. I didn't even know where to start. How do you help a kid who's addicted to heroin? I was like, what will the neighbors think? What will my family think? What's going on? Kind of mom am I to have a kid who's addicted to heroin? Like, I thought I did everything right, and here it is, and how sad for him, it's a heartbreaking moment.
It's the most isolating experience of life.
What's so isolating about it?
Well, because people have opinions, most of them are not informed opinions, most of them are not based on facts. Most of them are based on emotion, or they know one person, and I always like to say, well, if you think that every drug addict is the same, then you must think that every person is the same, because it's not true. You know what I mean? There are different types. There are people that are functioning, there are people that aren't functioning, there are people that aren't functioning that even if you take the drugs away from them will still not be functioning. You know what I mean? There are so many different things, but the main thing I think is that stigma of that you did something wrong as a parent.
Yeah, and I think everybody felt that way until we all got together. And then once we started talking about our children and we met, senators and representatives and there would be a whole table of us, then I think we sort of felt like we didn't really need to explain who we were as parents, because here we all got on a plane, we all went to Washington, D.C., we were all paying for our own hotels, we were paying for our own meals, we were doing this on our own dime, and that these congressional staff knew that if we put this much time and attention into fighting for our children after they were gone, we had to be those same kind of parents when our children were alive too. And
what was the common thread among the parents that you spoke with? What did you realize that binded all of you together?
Well, what I realized right away was that these were all wonderful people who gave their kids, a good home life, good summer vacations, good education, a ton of love, adored these children. And the other thing that I learned when I was talking with them is that we mostly all said the same thing about our children. Our children weren't the tough guys on the street, the big football jocks, the bullies. Our children were all the ones who were very sensitive, who cared about other people, who felt other people's pain, who wanted to help anybody. And it became then that I realized that the softer and the biggest heart that you have growing up is what makes you, that gift of empathy is also the sword that can kill you. Because while you're feeling so badly for other people and wanting to help everybody else, you're feeling their pain so greatly that you hurt. And you've already got hurt from something in your childhood, and that you're taking in all this other hurt from all these people around you. And that combination is probably the lethal dose that makes you want to self-medicate, if that makes sense.
We did some research, got him into a detox, and then it was hard because he had to, find another place for him to go. What was the right thing to do? What should we do inpatient? Should we do outpatient? What's the right thing for him? And he didn't want to go away anywhere. He's like, I'll do an outpatient program. I'll go wherever you want me to go. Just don't send me away somewhere. The detox scared him a lot.
30 days? Are you kidding me? That's a fucking joke. You're going to put somebody away for 30 days and think they're going to get clean? Like, come on. No. She got put away for 30 days, came out and used again.
We were able to get him into Gosnell. It required a whole lot of calls. And at that time, he had Mass Health. And they would only pay for detox. So number one, he had to go in either high or drunk, which is a huge problem. Otherwise, insurance won't pay for it. And once he got there, they would only pay for like 5 days. We had to pay thousands thereafter to keep him there just another few days. And, you know, these kids develop this addiction over a period of time. It's not something that happens in 4 days, 30 days, 90 days. Yet the treatment for it, if you're lucky, you might get 90 days in a treatment facility. But you can't cure this. This is something that's always going to be there. It's something you have to battle against for the rest of your life. To put somebody in detox for, you know, 3-4 days and then just throw them back to the wolves is just, it's not adequate. And it doesn't work 90% of the time.
I was the person who pushed my son towards the doctors. I had such a strong belief that you don't try to cure things yourself. You go to a professional. We're in Boston, the hospital capital of the country. We have the best medical help. You go get the best help you can. And the doctors and the rehabs turned out to be nothing but more legal drug pushes, in my opinion. And I thought they did him a great disservice. I wish they would model public care as they do private care and get the costs down, because people can't afford $35,000 a month when somebody needs to be there of a minimum of 3 to 6 months. I mean, how does the average person afford that?
One of the other issues is he would go to NA meetings and tell me that there were drug dealers outside waiting for these, you know, these people who are going to the NA meetings to come out, and that's how they did their business. They would take the most vulnerable people suffering from substance use disorder and go to meetings and wait outside for them.
The Newton Wellesley was unprepared for someone like him. The staff there, for whatever reason, just wasn't familiar with what addicts look like. They were very unsympathetic, and in fact, the entire system at that time, this is 2014, the entire system there was oriented to, you know, the kinds of problems upper middle class Newton and Wellesley people run into, which isn't addiction behavior. So he got, because he was making stirring up so much trouble in rejecting responsibility, which is a classic kind of thing an addict does. It's like you're talking about a different person than the one that was originally there. They gave him bad marks in terms of his behavior. He was there about a month, and those bad marks actually prevented him, we were told, we were led to understand, that he couldn't go to any of the rehab programs that we identified that might be right for him, because he'd been essentially made out to be a troublemaker, and that was one of the many ironies of the systems at that time.
So things started getting spiraled downhill, and then you said he picked up again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he got clean for a very long time. Yeah, multiple years. And he was doing really well.
He got up every single time he had to and took the train into Boston. And even when the trains weren't running, he took the bus and got there. And he did what he had to do. So we were really, really proud of him. He graduated that EMT program. And it was like we got Nick back. That original, funny, risk-taking, goofy kid, he was back. Like, wow, everything was good. Everything was good. Like, if you said to anybody, I'd say, my family is doing great right now.
He finally decided on Monday night that he wanted to get off all drugs, and he wanted to go on Vivitrol, and that he was ready to give up drinking. And he was up in his old bedroom, and I went in and I was talking to him. And we pinky promised that we would not spend any more winters here in New England, because he wanted to move out to the West Coast and I wanted to move to Europe. And he was, you know, we made a plan. He had a whole plan.
He definitely, once he got to Thayer, was happier. And I remember him saying, at one point that it's kind of nice to feel like a normal person. And that sticks with me till this day, because he didn't feel like a normal human being. He felt there was something so wrong with him, and he expressed shame tons of times. He said even among the drug community, people who use IV drugs were considered like the lowest of the low. Those were his words.
But by the time he left the rehab, he was ready to accept the point that he was addicted, and that this was a dangerous situation, and that he needed to do something drastically different. And so we looked at programs both in Massachusetts and in Florida. It seemed to be the other place at the time that had anything available that might take him, and concluded that we needed to keep an eye on him basically all the time to keep him from falling back into getting back into his addiction. I mean, he was still an addict, but he was a dry addict at this point.
He got out on December 21st, and we had the best Christmas that we'd had in so many years. He was clean and sober. He was himself. It was the first time I really thought I had my boy back.
This was 7 months from the time he told us that he was addicted to heroin.
Mm-hmm.
Took that 7 months to go through treatment and finish his EMT program. And when I tell you everything seemed fine, everything seemed fine. His color was back. He had gained a little weight. Everything was good. He had his girlfriend. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. Nick had gone out with a friend, a person I didn't really know, but they were going to the movies. And I didn't think anything of it, because everything, like I said, we had transitioned during these months into, wow, everything's good. And I had been out somewhere and came home, and my daughter said, Nick's still not home yet. And I said, well, the movie's probably, until 11 or so. I said, he'll be home soon. And she goes, something doesn't feel right. Why don't you check on him? I texted Nick and said, where are you? And he said, I'm coming home. I'll be home in like 2 seconds. And he walks in the door, and everything looked fine. He puts his head right into the refrigerator, starts getting, some food and stuff. And that's the last time I talked to him. I actually, while he had the door open, I said, are you sure everything is okay? Just because of what Olivia said. And I put my hands on his face and made him look at me. Because now I know those eyes that I always thought were just kind of from pot, were like, pay attention, Mom. And everything looked fine. And he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I love you. I just don't want anything to happen to you. You're okay? And he's like, I'm okay. I love you. I'm grabbing something to eat. I'm going to bed because I got to get up early for the early shift for work. And I said, okay. Off he went.
Sue's father, my wife's father, had been just diagnosed with lung cancer and had a few months, or actually less than a month, to live once they discovered it. And Sue wanted to go out there and spend his last days with him. And he lives in Walnut Creek in California, just outside of San Francisco. So she was going to go there. I wanted Steve to stay here, but since I had to go to work, that was going to have him in the day program during the day, and then I'd stay with him at night. Steve didn't want to do that. He wanted to go with Sue. He did have a relationship with his grandfather, a very good one, and he wanted to see him too, and genuinely did.
The day that she died, 2 clinicians went to pick her up at the house, so I thought they had a bed for her at Star. And I said, good, you're gonna go get help? And she said, yeah. And I said, okay. So they came, got her, they brought her there. And then I called her around 10 o'clock on her cell phone, and she answered, and she said, Ma, they don't have a bed. I'm not staying here waiting. I've been here all morning. And I said, why don't they have a bed? I thought the clinicians came got you. She said, yeah, I thought so too, but they don't have one. And she says, I'm not sitting here forever waiting for one, because I don't even think they're going to end up having one. So she ended up leaving. and that's when she went home and used.
When they got out there, because Sue's father was in hospice care, there was a vial of morphine that they kept in the refrigerator that Steve realized was there. And that a couple of days in, as they were staying with Grandpa, he took the morphine, and my wife discovered that he had done that. But because he was already in legal problems here, he had to go back to court. We had delayed it, gotten it delayed, or he had, because he was out visiting his grandfather. We didn't want to call an ambulance, because it was an addiction, because it was taking illegal medication, that this would end up involving the police now on the West Coast. My wife decided, I wasn't there, I was still here. My wife decided to let him sleep it off. But unfortunately, during the night, he vomited and choked on his own vomit and died in his sleep. I got the call. I was at work, got on a plane, most nightmarish flight I've ever had, back to California, and you know, it was that shock of him being gone. That all happened so fast. The realization there was a really serious problem to the point where he died was maybe 6 or 8 months.
The day that it happened, something was telling me something was wrong. I knew something was wrong, and then that's when I went to her house. I knocked on the outside door. I opened the outside door. It was locked, so I couldn't get in at all. So I called. On the way there, I was saying to myself, God, if the lights are on, my daughter's dead. That's what I was, because I knew something was wrong, because she would not answer the phone. I kept calling. So I asked my boyfriend to go with me that day, and he's like, you always say something's wrong. You always do. I said, no, this is different. This is different. Something is wrong. So I got there, and as soon as I pulled up, all her lights are on, and I said, oh my God, she's dead. And I knew right then, I knew my daughter was dead. So I got on the phone, I called 911, I said, can you send somebody down here, please, please hurry right away. And they're like, what's wrong? And I said, I think my daughter's dead in our house. I think she OD'd. So they got there like in 5 minutes. So I was on the porch when they got there, and he came over to me and he said, he looked at me in my face and he said, how sure are you? I said, I'm 100% sure she's in there. He said, bam, kicked the door down, kicked the second one. There she was. And I wanted to go run to her, and they wouldn't let me. And she was dead.
In the morning, I woke up, and I pulled the shade up, and his car was still out front. And I was like, oh, I thought I heard him up a little while ago, and getting ready. That's weird. And I said, well, his car's having trouble. Maybe he ended up getting a ride or something. And I said, texted him, where are you? Your car's here, but you're not. Because I had yelled up to his room. And my kids were always ones that, if you yell, hey, get out of bed, they got out of bed right away. You didn't have to keep hounding them and stuff like that. And I started to get ready for my day, thinking, oh, he must have got a ride because he didn't answer me. And I was just about ready to go to the gym, and then I said, you know what? Why don't you go upstairs and double check? And his room is in the attic. It's like a walk-up attic. And I walked up there, and as soon as I saw him, he was blue. And he was like halfway in and halfway out of the bed, and I screamed. I knew immediately, oh my God, he had gotten drugs from that kid last night that he was out with. And I screamed for them, my husband and my daughter, and I said, get the Narcan, because we had been trained on the Narcan, on how to use it when we went to the Mass General program. It was one of those old ones, though, which thank God they don't use anymore. Now they have a one-step Narcan that you just push in like a nasal spray. This was a three-piece part you had to put together and turn and spin and push it in, right? And immediately started CPR on him and used the Narcan, and I called 911. But I knew, like, looking at him, he was cold and blue, and I knew he was gone. And it was the last thing that I would have expected in my life on that day, because everything seemed, you know, just fine.
So basically, my son was found at 7:30 in the morning. They did not get in touch with me. They called and left messages on my phone. And then they didn't get in touch with me. I called them. I was in a place where I had no reception, so I didn't get the messages until I got home. And it was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so I called them. And they said they were coming over. I knew they're not going to come over to tell me my kid's in trouble. They're going to come over to tell me he's dead. You know, so I knew at 4:30 in the afternoon. But that's how long.
It was about midnight, and I woke up. It was September 11th, going on to midnight, just before midnight. And I woke up and I checked my phone, and his biological father had left me 5 messages. I thought that was very bizarre, and I remember sending my oldest son a text and saying, I just had 5 missed calls from Mary's father, and I'm really concerned. I'm afraid to call him. So I started sort of making my way downstairs, and I was pacing a little bit, and I finally got his father on the phone, and I said, Ray, I had 5 missed calls from you. What's going on? And he said, can I call you back in a couple of hours? And I said, absolutely not. And then I heard him say, can you speak to her? I thought he was talking to my son. I heard a male voice come on the phone, and he said, hello, Zelia. My immediate thought was, why is Ray Ray calling me Zelia? Then the officer said, hi, this is officer such and such. We found some drug paraphernalia. I'm thinking my son's under arrest, or there was some sort of skirmish between the two of them, whatever. It never occurred to me that this was the call I was about to get. And he said, you know, when we got here, unfortunately, your son was already gone. And I remember saying no. And I heard the officer say, yes, I'm very sorry. I dropped to my knees, and I was just screaming at the top of my lungs. I remember running up the stairs, sort of crawling on my hands and knees as I was running up the stairs, screaming my husband's name. My memories sort of turn on and off at this point. I have memories of screaming up at the top of the stairs. I have memories of being on my hands and knees in my kitchen and screaming as loud as I could. And my daughter, who at the time was 13, came out of her room, and she looked so frightened. I remember looking up, and she said, what's wrong? And I saw my husband say, Ray Ray died.
Apparently, he had left because a friend had called him on January 2nd and asked him to pick him up. He had no ride out of the rehab. He was at the rehab where Stephen was. And Steve went to go get him. And while they were in the car, he said to Stephen, let's just go get something. But the person he was with had just been dosed with methadone before he got out of the rehab. But Steve had nothing in his body. And I guess fentanyl had just hit Boston, like that month. That was Christmas of 2014. And 13 days later, I would get the call from Boston Medical Center that he was there. And I didn't even stop to understand what was going on. They just said, you know, we have your son here, and he's in the emergency room. And I just hung up the phone, and I think I ran every red light. I was like there in 10 minutes, and they wouldn't let me in to see him. And they said they were cleaning him up. I didn't even know what that meant. I thought they were like shaving his face. I think it was just a state of shock, and it all just happened so quickly. So the police had told me that both of them didn't make it, but that wasn't true because the passenger, because of the methadone and the little bit of a blocker he had in his body, made him come to. But when he did, I guess he walked to the ambulance. He had no idea what had happened. And the people who were looking out into the car and saw my son passed out didn't go out there to give him CPR. Instead, they just opened the doors and robbed whatever they could get in the car, you know, his iPhone and his money and whatever else was there. And because he didn't have CPR done to him for maybe 20 minutes when I got to the hospital, they had transferred him to ICU and told me he was brain dead. So, thank you. I spent the next 7 days just praying for a miracle, but he never woke up. He was intubated that whole time. And I couldn't even take him because of the weather, and they couldn't even transfer his body for 3 weeks. So I couldn't wake him till almost the end of January. And I guess I've been in a state of shock ever since.
And I guess what I didn't take in during the classes is that an opioid addiction is a very relapsable disease, that they most likely relapse at some point. And I wasn't thinking about that at all or prepared for that at all. And they came and tried to revive him. And it was kind of ironic because he doesn't have a closet in his room, so we have one of those bar closets, you know, just a hanger type of thing, and all his EMT clothes were all up there and all pressed and ready to wear, and there they are, the EMTs and everybody working on him with those hanging like right above his head. It was just like a surreal moment. And they got him down and brought him to the hospital and said, meet us there. They had a faint heartbeat. And but when we got there and said the front desk, they sent us to that room that you never want to get taken to, the little quiet, private family room. So I knew it wasn't going to be good. And then the doctor came out and said there was no brain activity or cardiac activity, and he was dead.
You can't help but wonder what you did wrong when you have a child who's that sick. When you have to, you know, you have to see your son for the last time in a casket. You can't help but wonder, where did I go wrong? What signs did I miss? What more could I have done? Those are questions that will be in my head until my dying day.
Like looking back at next life, that I wish I had done something different, wish I had done something different, but hindsight is always 20/20.
What could you have done different? It seemed to me that you were aware of the situation, you talked it out, you resolved the things, you compromised with him. In terms of you could have done different, what could you possibly have done?
Well, after the fact, I learned that you can actually have someone go to treatment for a marijuana addiction.
But did you feel it was an addiction at that time?
I don't know if I would have used the word addiction at that time, because I don't think I knew anything about marijuana addiction. I just thought people smoked it casually and it wasn't really that big of an issue.
You know, I went to Al-Anon meetings, and, you know, the first thing they say, get them out of the house and let them hit rock bottom and, you know, throw them out and tell them that, you know, this is their life and they need to do it. That's a really, really hard thing. And, you know, I always took my son back as long as he went to rehab, as long as he was going to meetings, as long as he was going to the doctors, as long as he was doing what they wanted him to do and putting in the effort. I wanted to support him in all that. And so then finally, when it didn't work after all those rehabs, I think Stephen was in 8 or 9 times during his addiction. The one time I tell him, you need to go in sober living because I think I've made it too easy for you, and he's gone 13 days after, I have to live with that. I have to live with, if he was home, would I have found him? Would it have not happened? Would he still be alive? Would I have found him right away like I did the day after Thanksgiving? I mean, I don't know.
I don't know.
What could I have done differently? I don't know. And I think about it, and when I look at all the different parenting styles, and yet we're all still in the same boat, I can't tell you that there's any right way. I think we all have to cross our fingers and hope sometimes, you know.
You talked about it's a preventable disease or preventable death. And that is the feeling that I get from those who haven't walked your path yet. Or do not know somebody close to them.
Right.
They have that resentment that is, people have to be responsible. They have to take responsibility of their lives.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know, doing what you do, supporting other parents, how do you counter that argument?
Well, when I hear that argument, I get really angry. And I don't know that you can convince everybody that it's a disease, and
what don't they know?
What they don't know. They don't know how the brain works. They don't know the brain chemistry changes once you do take that opioid or whatever. Like I try to say to them, okay, how many of you when you were teenagers did stupid things? Because that's what teenagers do. A lot of them. They take risks. They'll drink beers. They'll do, just stupid things. Lots of us did that as teenagers. We made choices to hang with a group of kids and do this or do that. What we don't know is which person is going to get addicted when they do these foolish teenage choice things, right? So you could have been someone who drank beers all the time with your friends as a teenager, and you grow up and you don't have any problem. You can have a drink whenever you want. Well, the buddy next to you who was doing that now drinks, a bottle of vodka every day. But you didn't know back then, when you both were making the same choice, who was going to end up with the addiction.
Did you know that it was a disease? How did you see the fight
I
against
didn't
opioids?
believe it was a disease initially. I thought it was his choice. And it took me a long time. I feel badly now when he used to say to me, Mom, it's the disease. And I would say to him, if you never took anything, that disease wouldn't have affected you. Even taking pills was one thing. But the day that you picked up and decided that if you couldn't get pills, that the solution would be to stick a needle in your arm, didn't you know the curse you were putting on yourself for the rest of your life? And it would sort of end there, because it would be, I was so adamant that if he didn't do that, and he was so adamant that it was a disease, that he had no choice, that the brain overpowered, the addiction overpowered his will. And
when did all that change? When did your belief change?
I think after he passed. And I wish I knew sooner, because as close as we were and as we told each other everything, I think if I had known and let him know that I believed it was a disease, that maybe he would have found a little comfort in knowing that I was the soft shoulder to fall on, or that I could give him, not the encouragement, because I gave him encouragement constantly, and the thing I never wanted him to lose was hope, because I figured once you lose hope, you lose everything.
I didn't know the disease then. She asked me to go to a meeting with her one time, and I said, all right, and then we never even got there, because she wanted me to learn more about it. Because she's like, it's in your head. She kept telling me it's in your head. I said, how could it be in your freaking head, Caitlin? Come on, don't think about it. Do other things. Think about something else. And she's like, but you don't understand. And I didn't. I really didn't understand it until after my daughter died.
There's so many people out there who say, oh, this isn't a disease. And I say to them, get educated. Because, let me tell you, karma's a funny thing. You start talking about other people's children who have this disease, I never thought it would hit my doorstep. But it does. And inevitably, with the numbers and the way that they are rising, this is an epidemic, it's becoming a pandemic. It is going to reach everyone's doorstep eventually. So if you're not educated, if you're not able to cope and help your children cope, you're going to end up in my shoes, and that's what I'm trying to prevent.
As surreal as it was to understand that Alex is no more, did that cement your knowledge any further, or did you find yourself learning something completely different about this disease? Did you know it was disease when Alex was suffering, or you knew it was disease when he passed?
I knew it was disease, but I always thought that personal and mental strength really played into the equation, and I learned very quickly that that wasn't the case, or that isn't always the case. I mean, anybody can say yes just once, you know, it doesn't matter how strong you are. And like I said, it doesn't matter how smart you are either. But I did learn that it was something that was very much out of his control. And unfortunately, he succumbed to an illness that he was not able to beat.
When your son was having his teeth removed, did the doctor sit down with you? Do you remember any point of educating you what this is and what he will be taking?
The doctors don't know. I guess in all of the 8 years that they go to medical school, I read somewhere that they have 1 hour, I think they spend with them talking to them about writing prescriptions and opiate use. In fact, I heard a veterinarian gets more training on pain medicine than a doctor does. So I only know that the doctors maybe thought they were helping their patients initially, but once all these overdoses started, the continuation of writing these prescriptions, I think, was nothing but sheer greed, because I believe these pharmaceutical companies either paid them cash or gave them trips to Hawaii or made it good for them to feel good about themselves writing these prescriptions.
Loss comes in so many shapes. There is the loss of a son. Finances also. Yes. You invested a lot, and I'm not a parent, but you invest on your children, and you are able to, so one day they don't have to struggle with debt, with whatever. They can pick up their lives and make something out of themselves. But there's also family. It changes the dynamic of the family. You're telling me about your daughter with anger, anxiety, grieving, combination of so many feelings at once. So could you talk more about what this loss, what this disease has, how it has changed your family dynamic?
Yes, dramatically.
It's like the, everything you do, there's like a little asterisk to it, you know, like anything that seems to be happy, that most people will be like, yay, this is great, we're having a great time. It's always got that undercurrent of sadness to it because he's not there. Holidays aren't the same. It always feels like someone's missing. You know, the table has 5 chairs around it in the kitchen. There's always one empty. You know, it's a glaring reminder that he's not there. I think about him all the time. It's almost like a drumbeat. You know, you think you have your, thought of something, and then you think Nick, and then the thought of something else, and you think Nick. It's weird. I think more about him now dead than I did when he was alive. And I've heard that from other parents too. It's like you can't stop thinking about it. Like, I wish I could, but I love him so much. I miss him so much, you know, so.
I'd say when you go through this type of tragedy, the mourning that goes along with it, you find out very quickly who your friends are. And you find out that people really don't want to deal with this topic. It's very isolating. Definitely, I stick very close to my husband and children. As a parent, it changes how you parent. You definitely parent from a place of fear and guilt more. I am constantly praying and frightened that, you know, something could happen to the 3 children that I have left. So it changes everything about the family dynamic. My daughter, who was the happiest kid you could ever think of, she was always smiling. After her brother's death, she went through such a depression. Those first 2 years were rough on everyone, but specifically I saw big changes in her. Tried to put her in counseling and she wouldn't talk. The counselor said, I can't help her. She will not speak to me. Would not speak at all. She's just starting to come out of that, and I'm so grateful to God for that. You know, her twin was kind of the opposite. He's really funny and strong-willed too, but he's not one to really show a lot of emotion. So that's how he's dealt with it. I worry about that too. My oldest son was devastated, but he's in the Coast Guard. He's a military man, so he knows how to cope with his feelings. And I'm super proud of all my children, and that includes my son that's in heaven.
I feel lucky that we we'd managed to stay together for the most part, and not turn on each other, which I can see there's definite potential for that, and all the anger and grief. It's all this energy that can come out. So I think part of it was we talked to a lot of therapists and groups, and that talking and trying to come to terms, including with my daughter and with my wife, was really important. If we just tried to sit with it or plow through it, that would have been disastrous.
On the money side, it was a second mortgage to pay for the private rehabs. And later on, as I was working to get that down, it was another refinance to pay for his funeral. But I realized, like, a lot of people can't do that. A lot of people don't have a good job to begin with, or are not well enough, or they're too old to be working, 75 hours a week like I was doing. On the financial ramifications were hard enough, but the mental and physical toll that it took on me, and especially my parents, who this was their only grandson and their firstborn grandchild, my mom and dad were never the same. I think their life was shortened by the loss of Stephen. And just, it tears away at the family fabric, because some people understand addiction and other family members don't, and some give you empathy, and some gives the person who's addicted empathy, and some family members tell them just grow up and straighten out and stop doing drugs, and then you get mad at a family member for saying that to your child because they don't understand, and so it just rips families apart. I
think one of the ironies is that there'd been this terrible epidemic of crack cocaine, in the years before the opiate addiction crisis, that there'd been no caring about it either, and that the communities that were decimated by that, except for a few understanding people, the attitude in the United States, particularly among the white population, was that that's their problem, that's their responsibility. So I think that now that it's our children, the white community in the bubble, it suddenly becomes a crisis. It's long been a crisis, and the horror of that insensitivity has come to me. That's one thing. That's what I meant by some realizations I've had about what it actually means, and what we've been so unaware of, and pretty much continue to be unaware of in these bubble communities like Newton. When I say bubble, I mean they're insulated from a lot of the realities of life in a lot of the United States.
You were saying that you were one of those who lived in a little bubble. You might have heard of
drug addiction problems. You talked about the cocaine, but it felt like it's their problem, and it's something that you never thought will come into this house. How much did you know, compared to that, how much did you know about opioids, about addiction, that even the day that he went to the dentist and he was given Oxycontin, did that raise any flags, or were you just entrusting of the authorities, the doctors, that they knew what they were doing?
That's a good question, because I think I viewed myself, and I think my wife the same way, as pretty knowledgeable about medication. I mean, she's a psychotherapist. I'm a scientist. I am aware of chemical addiction and how that works. But all of that was kind of dry knowledge that had no emotional connection. I felt insulated, as you're pointing out, from that. It wouldn't happen to us because it doesn't happen to good people, people who take responsibility and are careful. And we thought we were careful. I mean, we basically have gotten to where we are, being financially comfortable and basically doing the kinds of jobs we want by following the rules or knowing what the rules are. And here was completely out of our ability to understand. And
I was waking up to a few things about the reality that, is it nature versus nurture? Is it a disease, or a choice? Those things I had struggled with for a while. But one thing I never struggled with was the empathy for people who've been neglected in society. I always think that there's never been enough done for the poor, unless somebody has been poor and has done better and remembered where they were and want to go back. It's a certain type of person that really has a true empathy, really has a need to want to care. And I think that when it comes to, a lot of state officials, with the exception of a few, I mean, there are wonderful senators and representatives that we have up in the State House, but the person ultimately in charge, the governor and the mayor of the city, they're ultimately, it starts at the top and it trickles down. And when you talk about the people who really can make a difference, I don't think that they stepped up to the plate fast enough. I think there's slowly being a difference made, but I don't think we have time for it to be slow. I think somebody has to do something drastic right now. Listen, President Reagan started the war on drugs. It didn't work then, and it's not working now.
At the moment, the state, there's a big exposure. Things have changed quite a lot. The state is now persecuting, wanting these pharmaceutical companies to take responsibility of the part that they played in this epidemic, this disease. So as you follow that case, to you, what does justice look like?
I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'd like to see that money that was made, the companies that benefited and that wantonly either ignored or actively ignored the consequences. I'd like to see that money go 100% to helping the mental health system in its response to addiction.
Well, I'm hoping for the first time in American history that we really learn from our mistakes and that we collectively never let this happen again. And in terms of justice, I want to see every pharmaceutical and distributing company that produced and shipped these pills by the millions to these cities and towns, I want to see them bankrupt and out of business. And I want to see whoever was in charge at the FDA punished, and I want to see regulations put in place so that this can never happen again. That before something is allowed to be marketed and brought to the public, that they've already had, you know, a couple, 2-3 years to really test and see what this formula is, because it's not just opiates. It seems like they're releasing things all the time.
What advice do you have parents who are listening, and not that they have to go through something like this in order to understand, but just from a person who you have already been there? What do you say? What should they take away from this?
I think addiction is really something that is swept under the rug, and a lot of people choose to ignore it. And it creates this cloud of ignorance surrounding, you know, what makes a good person versus a bad person. A good person would never take a drug. Well, that's not true. But that seems to be the general consensus about, you know, drug addiction, that only a bad person or only someone who, you know, grew up with life struggles or couldn't seem to manage their own, you know, issues or challenges, and that's not the case. And people are prescribed, you know, opioids as painkillers if they're in an accident or for whatever, and sometimes, pretty frequently actually, it's too difficult for them to actually get off that prescription drug. So we're not just talking about addiction that occurs from, you know, the use of street drugs and heroin, but real prescription medication. It's the same addiction, it's the same problem, and people die from them.
It is a disease, and you got to try doing everything in your power to help your child beat this, no matter what. And like, I didn't do enough. I wish I had that chance again to do it over. I wish I did, and I don't. And the ones that are going through it, I know their pain. I live it every single day of my life. And it's the worst pain in the world.
Everybody needs to worry about substance use disorder, whether it's marijuana. If you know your child is vaping marijuana, smoking marijuana, don't let it go. You need to be serious about it. You can't say, oh, I smoked when I was young, so no big deal. Don't be part of the community that's, oh yeah, I'm letting my kids drink down in the basement because they're safer there. And they could be the kid that grows up to become an alcoholic. The people who poo-poo it all are the people that probably have someone in their family that hasn't talked to them, that has somebody close to them that has issues. It touches everybody, and for people to think that it doesn't, I don't know what to tell them. Get your head out of the sand. We all need to work, even people that don't have somebody directly, immediately affected. If we all work together and all try to help prevent it, we can make change.
Not everybody is the same, and that's why you have to take the stigma out. And if we can deal with not stigmatizing people, then maybe more people will get help, and more people like my son that are working and, you know what I mean, and trying to do the right thing. And maybe we could keep them working and functioning, because I know that my son loved working. Like, he felt like work helped with his depression.
It shouldn't have to be that we have to experience this pain in order to get society the help it needs. We need to figure out a system that will work, a rehab that is something that's more ongoing than just, you know, hey, insurance will pay for detox, then you're back out on the street.
So my statement is that it's morally unacceptable for us to not use the science we have and point it at the problem of addiction, and, you know, let's say opiate addiction in particular, and find corrective treatment like a disease. And then a lot of the problems that, of trying to assign, I mean, it used to be that when you were sick with certain diseases, in the Middle Ages, you were viewed as being punished, that you had done something morally deficient, and the fact that you got bubonic plague or that you suffer, cancer was God's mark on you. And that's kind of how drug addiction is now. We have more sophisticated terminology, but that's really where it's coming from. And once those diseases were understood scientifically, all those judgments went away.
Be kind. Show empathy and some understanding, because the person that you turn your back on in disgust might one day be a relative of yours. Because addiction doesn't discriminate. It doesn't have to be a child. It could be a parent. A lot of elderly get addicted to these same pills and sort of lose their mind. And whether it's a cousin, a niece, a nephew, an aunt, an uncle, your child, it runs the gamut. It doesn't know color, it doesn't know age, it doesn't know financial status. Addiction does not discriminate. And don't ever be too harsh to judge somebody, because the person that you might have to judge one day might be your own.
One of the things that we've learned over the past 50 years, kind of understanding the science of addiction, is that it is a disease, that it actually alters your brain chemistry in ways that make taking drugs a compulsive behavior, right? So it really takes away the element of choice. And, if you talk to people who are addicted, they will often tell you that they continue to use drugs in spite of not wanting to do it, or in spite of very negative consequences, right? So the hallmark of addiction is that you continue to use drugs in spite of significant negative consequences. And that's hard for some people to understand. Like, they say to themselves, like, why can't people just stop? And that's really, in essence, what makes addiction a disease, that it alters the chemistry of your brain in such ways that people become very, very, very sick if they stop using drugs. So, often when you talk to people who use drugs, they'll tell you, like, they're no longer using drugs to get high. They're basically using drugs just to feel normal and not to get very, very sick. So, while people often kind of start using drugs and are making choices about start using, once people become addicted, the element of choice really becomes kind of something that people can't consider. And I think, part of what's hard for people to understand about addiction is, that people continue to use drugs in spite of some really negative consequence. And, people often say, to people who have overdosed, for example, like, why do people continue to use drugs even right after they've overdosed? And I think that is how, in essence, compulsive drug use has become. So it really does kind of alter the portions of your brain that are responsible for judgment and decision making. And it really makes your brain crave drugs to the extent that you're willing to do almost anything to get drugs. And that's why people commit crimes. That's why people do all sorts of things that many people find challenging and find difficult to use. So, it really is. And again, if you look at brain images of people who use drugs, you'll see how kind of using drugs alters your brain to such an extent that compulsive use of drugs really becomes probably the only thing that people are thinking about. I think that one of the drivers of this opioid epidemic was the overprescribing of opioids for a wide variety of conditions. And I think part of what we have to do, whether that's parents or us as individuals, is to make sure that we understand that there are risks associated with opioids. So if you're a parent, I think it's really important to kind of question prescribers and medical professionals if they are prescribing opioids, to ask if there are other alternatives for pain other than opioids. So for instance, if your child is getting tooth extraction and the dentist wants to prescribe opioids, to kind of question whether or not they need them, whether or not there's other things that they can take to alleviate their pain. So I think we're trying to kind of not only re-educate the medical community about effective and safer opioid prescribing, but also make sure that parents and other caregivers are aware that there is significant risk associated with using opioids, and particularly using opioids for a long period of time.